Hey guys, John Cook back again, another Team Tips video. On this episode I want to talk about post-crash inspection and damage that may not be readily apparent. A couple things I've noticed, not just on the Compass machine, but on other machines I've flown as well, that people sometimes overlook after crashing is checking certain bolts or screws for what I call shock damage. And what that means is that when the helicopter crashes, there's quite a jar or shock to it, and certainly things break, blades, tail blades, links, that sort of thing, and bent main shafts and so on and so forth, and a lot of that's pretty apparent. But that shock damage isn't always apparent, and you can fix your helicopter and get it back to what you assume to be flying condition, and then within a flight or two experience a parts failure because of this shock damage. And specifically, one of the things I look at is in the head mechanics. And on a flybarless machine, I don't know, you might argue that it's more pertinent to check for shock damage because of the loads being concentrated directly to the grips and grip arms, but on a flybar head to go through it all and check. And what I'll do is I'll get my driver and I will go to the grip arm bolts and just with two fingers just see if I can loosen it. And on this one it's loose, and I must confess, before I got the video out, that's one thing that I remembered to do this, or reminded me to do this, was that this one was loose, so I pulled out the camera. But in any event, this was loose, and again, we'll go around to the other side. Again, two fingers is usually a pretty good indication if it's got enough torque, and see with two fingers I could loosen this one too. So I'll go through the different bolts. These are different sizes, so I'll do that in a sec. And then also too, what I find very important is going through the swashball screws, both on the servo 2 swash and also the grip arm 2 swash, making sure that they're taut, because I've often found them to loosen up. And in fact, on the 6HV last summer, there were some people saying they were having, in fact, you can see right there, this one is loose, and I hadn't touched this prior. So I'll usually go about with red Loctite, especially on these little screws, and just go through that and see. This one's appears to be tight, but I'll go through all this, make sure everything's looking good there, and then we'll get back to it here in a minute. I don't know how well you can see this. This is the nut I removed from one of the grip arms, and I actually started to remove some of the Loctite from it, but wanted to comment on that. If there's too much Loctite on the threads, you're not going to do yourself any favors by reapplying that. So what I'll do is just take my fingernail and turn the screwdriver or the hex driver left, which in effect will unscrew it from my nail, and that'll kind of help me clean out the threads. But you want to get them fairly cleaned out and then reapply Loctite to it, so that way you're going to get the best grip from the Loctite to the threads in the grip arm itself, in this case, without a lot of pollution of the threads. And potentially what could happen there is if you get too much of that Loctite caking in there, then you can actually almost strip out the threads in the aluminum, because that material really has no place else to go otherwise, and it'll kind of bore it out in effect. Even though it's a soft type material in the Loctite, again, once it starts getting compressed in the threads, there's really nothing else for it to do other than move something else. So wanted to mention that. So hope that helps you. Actually, as luck would have it, the fingernail trick didn't do the job on this other screw that I took out. So another tip that I could show you is taking an X-Acto blade and you run it across the proximal threads, or the nearest threads of the head, and just kind of lightly press down on it, and then again loosen it, And what that X-Acto will do is it'll follow the threads out. And actually really the better way to do it, but I'm lazy a lot of times, and the nail, and using your fingernail most times will take care of that for you. But again, this one was so polluted with Loctite that I had to do the X-Acto trick, and decided to show you that. And so here what I got is I'm just going to show you the Loctite application, and not that it's rocket science, but just show how I do it. A little bit of red, a dab on the end, and that's a little too much. Hopefully you can see it. But what I'll do is I'll just kind of wipe it down as I'm coming across it, kind of wipe off that excess. And what I want is about, sorry about that, dropped it. But what I want is about half the threads covered with the Loctite, and I use, again, red on the head, especially on smaller parts. Something else I wanted to mention too on reapplying this screw here is that when you screw into aluminum, it's potentially easy to strip out aluminum threads, and I've seen a lot of people do it. I've done it myself as well on various brands machines, so this isn't about one company being bad or so on and so forth. But when you screw into aluminum, you're going to want to be careful with your torque application. And as I mentioned, the two-finger loosening with the different parts, when I check for any loosening on that shock load, you know, generally 2 fingers on tightening, maybe 3. That'll give you enough torque on that wrench, and anything past that's kind of like, you know, my own version of a torque wrench, I suppose you could say. But you know, that gets me enough torque on the screw to say that it's tight enough, and it doesn't let me go to town on it too hard with gorilla torque to where I'm going to strip out the threads. So that's just something I've started to do myself in an effort not to strip out or ruin parts. You know, it's something you may want to try too. It may or may not work for you, but just throwing it out there. Alright, so it ended up being that there was one screw in each of the grip arms that was loose, and then also each of the swash balls that go from the grip to the swash, each of those were loose as well. The screws that go from the swash to the servos, they were all fine. Really nothing else too much takes a big shock load when it hits. I will go through the tail somewhat to address that, but my tail's pretty goofed up from my prior crash anyway, so that's not really going to do you much good. But in any event, you know, that's some of the hidden damage that I'll go through looking for on crashes. You know, most people already know to check a spindle, you just put a hex driver into one side, and you can spin the nut and watch the other grip to see if it moves, and if it does, then you can change the spindle out. Mine's fine. The main shaft looks fine. I don't get too excited about notchy bearings in the main bearing holders. You know, there's usually 2 or 3 of those. If they're a little notchy, I don't worry about it too much. I know some people get pretty anal about bearing smoothness. I haven't really noticed too much of a problem in flight with those type of bearing problems. Grip arm bearings, similarly, if they're a little notchy, I don't usually worry about them too much. If there's some flight issue, then I'll go chasing that down later. I run a Beast X, though. I don't have any way to monitor vibration levels. I know the V-bar guys, when they see their vibration levels going up, they may start chasing some of those things, and that may fix it. But again, I don't notice any flight characteristic changes or problems, so I'm not going to go about changing a lot of parts if I don't really notice a problem with it. It seems that the more experience I get, the lazier in some respects I get about, you know, that sort of maintenance. But conversely too, a lot of times you're crashing more just because you're pushing yourself harder. And then too, with experience, you know what you can and can't get by with sometimes. So I'm not saying it's the right thing to do. It's just kind of what I've been adopting. You know, I talked about at one point doing a video on what I call the fish wallow. I'll go ahead and briefly talk about that here, but hoping at some point to get some flight video of what it looks like, but this tail's kind of busted up from a crash. But what I've noticed on the 6HV and the 7HV as well is I just nicknamed it the fish wallow because I didn't really know what else to call it. But basically in flight, what would happen is the tail would just kind of slowly oscillate back and forth in about that far, as you can see in the video. And the reason I called it the fish wallow is it almost looks like a fish's tail fin when it's swimming in the water, just kind of slowly back and forth. And there's a couple things that causes that fish wallow that I've noticed. One of them is if one of these pins in the tail pitch actuation mechanism starts to come loose, and actually it'll drop down a little bit and let part of the hinge start coming free a little bit, so that'll allow it to cant a little bit and probably bind up to an extent and allow the tail not to work as smoothly as it normally would, and it's probably getting some binding, and as the tail tries to correct, it can't right away until it overcomes that force, and then it'll overcorrect, and then it'll do that fish wallow. And again, it's a real slow, smooth back and forth. So if you get that sort of fish wallow, number one, check the one of the pins in the two different areas where the pitch actuation kind of moves on the tail setup. The other thing I've noticed to cause it is the bearings in the tail. If the bearings in the tail, I've had them to where I couldn't even feel that they were notchy. I'd say probably half to 3/4 of the time it's the thrust bearings, but once in a while it will be one of the radial bearings. Now in the Atom 500, I believe there's one radial and a thrust bearing. In the 6HV, 7HV, there's 2 radial bearings and a thrust bearing. So you go through the tail, replace the bearings as you need to, and that should fix the fish wallow. But again, I'll try to do a video just more specific on that, but just wanted to mention it here on this hidden crash damage video. If it'll help someone more immediately, then by the time I get that other video done, then hopefully that'll be worth it then.